in a way, I'm glad there's no new visitors at church today, because you want new visitors, right? But on a day like today, imagine a new visitor came here and they're talking about money. Another church. Like, I go from church to church and they're always talking about money. But actually, we don't always talk about money at our church. The last time we actually did a series on money was 3 years ago, 2021. And I think it was called Money, Good or Evil. And so that's like way back in the archives, But we decided to do this month-long series on money because we wanted us to just explore the concept and dig deep into how we see money and how we view money. And we want it to be as practical as well as possible. So next Sunday we've got an elder from City on El Benoni. He's retired. He's got vast experience in the financial world. And so after the service next Sunday, it'll be a shortened service. He's going to come and spend an hour with us, just running us through various things that will be helpful practically, budgeting, this and that. And so we're really trying to do our best to try to help our people in terms of how we see money, how we use money, how we spend money. And as I was thinking about this during the week, I thought about some of the ways in which we handle money, right? So, for example, you have the spenders in the room. And what I mean by that is, you generally have to spend money on things, but on the odd occasion you get something extra, right? And your boss gives you a bonus at the end of the year, or you get cash gifts for your birthday or whatever. You're one of those people who thinks, what am I going to spend it on? And you want to spend all of it because, hey, I've got extra, I want to spend all of it, right? So that's a spender. But then you also get the savers, and I think I'm probably in that camp where you get extra money, you're like, no, I'm going to keep it, I'm going to bury it, I'm going to invest it because there's a rainy day that's coming, so I need to keep it. And sometimes, I think some people are in between the two, right? But if you're here today and you're more of a spender, just put up your hand, be bold. Yes, you're the spenders. And one of those people who put up their hands is my wife, because she's the complete opposite of me, right? I'm like, more money, ooh, more saving. She's like, oh, more money, ooh, more spending. I know it was your birthday yesterday, SK, well, not yesterday, but, this week, and Gio's birthday this week, and generally your birthday you get money, right? And so, but like, I promise you, like, I was given something for a wedding I did earlier on in the year, and that money is still in my cupboard. Because I'm like, no, let's just keep it, right? Because you never know. So you get the spenders, and you get the savers. But who here are more savers? Who are more like frugal, right? So I see I think there's less savers and more spenders in the room. Or maybe it's equal, I don't know. But, yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, I think it's important to acknowledge that the way we see money, the way we spend money, the way we invest money is often dependent on our personal history, right? So research shows that, for example, if you were born in the 1960s, that means that when you were a teenager, growing into adulthood, you were caught in the middle of a recession in the mid to late 70s. In the world, right? And some of the people who lived in that time were like, I remember that. And part of the global recession was because there was a war on oil, right? The Middle East, oil was burgeoning there, and so they were trying to monopolize the oil, and then the Americans were like trying to get the upper hand. So that had a devastating effect on economies around the world to such an extent that people had to queue for petrol. And you weren't allowed to fill your tank, right? You were given a ration. So people who were born in the 60s and who hit that recession in the late 70s apparently tend to be a little bit more frugal with their money. They're like, no, I remember those hard times. Like, I would rather just keep money to myself and be frugal about it. But people who were born in the 80s, like myself, we grew up in the late 90s where there was a booming economy around the world in the late 90s, and all of a sudden everything was surging, and up until we hit the recession in around about 2008 or so. And so people who grew up in the 80s tend to be more loose and more open, more liberal with their money. And so often when you were born determines how you spend your money. But that's not always the case, because often the kind of families we grew up in often determines how we spend our money, or the way we see our parents spend money is often how we would spend money as well. So I mean, I was fortunate to grow up in a home that we never lacked anything. We generally had whatever we wanted. But then I went from that to all of a sudden being a student where I had nothing. You know, where I had to scrap, where literally I had to like put 50 Rand petrol into the car every time, you know, because I didn't have much. And so that developed a frugal mindset for me. So that's why I'm more of a saver, because I'm more like, well, let's keep money in the background in case we need for an extra or for a rainy day, you know. So I think even as we kick off, it's important for all of us to realize that the way we think about money, it comes from somewhere. It comes from somewhere. It's not just you woke up one day and, you know, the way you spend money just is. It comes from somewhere. You have a mental framework, a mental model through which you see and view and spend money. So acknowledge that straight away, and then let's look at the text. So today's text is Matthew chapter 6, is Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount passage, and it's right smack bang in the middle of the sermon. And this is familiar for you guys, and I think, you know, I'm hoping and praying that you will see new nuggets in this text that Jesus speaks about. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19. It says, "Don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroy them, and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal." Let's just pause there for a moment. So Jesus is talking about treasures. He's not necessarily talking about money here, but I think we do know that money is ultimately what buys our treasures, right? So for example, if your treasure is security, like you want to be safe about the future, you're going to be a saver, right? Because you treasure security, and so you're going to save as much as possible. But if you treasure status, then you're going to be a spender, right? You'll spend money on a specific kind of car because you like the status that that car gives you. You will spend money on specific kinds of houses because ultimately it's a status thing, or even branded clothing. And so ultimately what you treasure is what you will spend your money on, right? So Jesus is talking about these treasures, and he's ultimately talking about temporary treasures and eternal treasures. And it's important to make that distinction in our minds, because he's saying here, there are some treasures that we treasure that are just temporary. They're going to be destroyed. And so if you spend all of your money on getting those treasures, ultimately what's the point? Because they're temporary, right? But there are some treasures that are eternal. They last forever. Are we spending more money on those kind of treasures that will last forever? And so Jesus is kind of setting up the context for us here. And I think, just to give you an example of my own life, I mean, it's no secret that I love books, Esther's going, I know that. But I really, I'm a voracious reader. I try to read about 50 odd books a year if I can. But I treasure books. You know why? Because I know the value of books. I know I've grown as a human being because of books. Books, when you tend to read books, they expand your mind, they help you be more creative. You actually become more compassionate when you read books, because you start to see the world the way that it is and not the way that you are. There's a famous Jewish proverb, I think from the Jewish Talmud. It says, we tend to see the world not as it is, but as we are. In other words, we have a very biased perspective of how we see the world and how we see people. And so that's one of the good things that books have done to me, is that it helps me see the world the way that it is, and not the way I are. So I can go on and on about books, but because I value books, I make provision for it in my budget, right? I'm going to spend a specific amount to get books because I know it benefits me as a human being. So I value it, I treasure it, so I don't really have a problem spending money on books, right? And so even as I'm talking about it, just think about some of the things that you treasure, that you don't think twice about putting your money into that. You don't think twice about spending your money on. The things that you think twice about are the things that perhaps you don't value as much. And then you're more hesitant, you're more guarded about spending money on those things. And just bear in mind, Jesus is not forbidding, enjoying things. He's not forbidding saving. He's not saying you shouldn't have any possessions. What he's talking about here is those critical words, store up. Right? What he's talking about is storing up. So that's literally amassing and accumulating temporal treasures. Because ultimately, friends, what I want to say is we are all investors. You might not think you're an investor. Like, you might not have a portfolio at Investec or RNB or Outsurance or whatever the case is. You might not be that kind of person who invests, but you're always investing when it comes to money. Think about it. So, for example, I pay school fees every month for my daughter, right? And I can either look at it and go, oh man, that's a big chunk of change every month, or I can go, I'm investing money into my daughter and her future. I'm investing money because I know that her time at school, her interactions with other pupils, her interactions with her teachers is developing her as a human being. It's enabling her to relate to other kids. The change that we saw in Mila from before school to after school is incredible. And so if I look at that and go, oh, I'm just spending money, as opposed to I'm investing money, it makes a difference in terms of how I see things. And so don't just think of how you spend money as spending money, but you're always investing, right? If you're investing in what you eat, depending on how you see your body. I'm investing in books. I'm not just spending money on books. I'm investing in it because I see the value of it. And so maybe start to shift your mindset a little bit from, well, I'm just spending, to actually I'm always investing. And the point is this a good or a bad investment? I think ultimately that's the point, right, when it comes to money. Is this a good investment or is it a bad investment? Is it helping me grow or not? Is it something that's temporary, that will be destroyed easily? Or is it something that will last? Is it something that will last for eternity? And I think that's part of what Jesus is trying to get at. I've never really claimed to have a lot of money. In fact, when I was about, 13 years ago, I started earning a little bit more than I could spend. So I thought, I have extra, what should I do about it? So that's when I started engaging in a financial advisor for the first time, and you can gauge by the mood of financial advisors how interested they are in you. Because if you have a lot to spend, then they're always your best friend, As soon as you answer, they'll pick up. But if you're like a guy who only invests a few $100 maybe a month, they're like, they really don't want to see you, And so I remember him even having to come to my house seemed like such a drag for him, such an effort for him, sitting across the desk and trying to explain these things to me. So he did prove to be a really great financial advisor. But as I said in the message on the group, Jesus is the greatest financial advisor in the world because of this slide. Because he accurately forecasts the future, and he tells us what are worthwhile investments. Right? He's the only one who can accurately forecast the future. A lot of financial investors, the way they forecast the future is based on past trends. Right? They say, look, these are some of the patterns we've observed, and so more or less, this is what financial markets are going to be in the next 6 months or so. But Jesus knows the future, and so he can accurately forecast the future, and then he tells you, these are worthwhile investments. If you spend money on these things, this is what's going to last forever. And so we should listen to Jesus when he speaks about these things, right? He's the greatest financial advisor that ever lived. And in this instance, he's trying to forecast our future, and he's also trying to speak to some of the things of the day that people really value. So back in those days, good clothing was very rare. We didn't have multiple clothing stores and tailors that made made clothes and different brandings. And so, the average person wouldn't really own a lot of clothing. They would own maybe like 3 or 4 pieces of clothing, right? And they would wear an item of clothing for days, maybe longer. And so they'd often have to go down by the river and wash. And so you didn't really own a lot of clothing because it was expensive to make clothing. And so what happened is, back in those days, I guess because of how they lived, you had certain kinds of moth larvae that used to make its home in the midst of people's clothing, right? And these kind of larvae used to actually feed on the cloth, feed on the clothes, and ultimately those clothes would get destroyed, right? And similarly, another way you measure someone's wealth back in those days is not just by the amount of clothes that they had, but also by the amount of crops that they had. But ultimately, sometimes those crops used to be destroyed by certain kinds of rust, the kind of rust fungi type of thing that used to destroy those crops, because obviously they didn't have fridges and those kind of things, right? And so Jesus is speaking to the very heart of what people struggle with in day-to-day lives. And he's saying, man, look at those things that you try and store up with, right? Lots of clothes and lots of crops. He's saying moths destroy them and rust destroy them. But these are temporary things, my friends, Jesus is saying. Don't try and store up. Don't try and keep investing your money into things that are temporary. That's what Jesus is trying to say. And that's why we freak out when we actually invest money in the stock markets, because we're afraid we're going to lose that money. So the question is, what do you value today? And what do you spend money on? And are those things temporary, or will they last forever? Because ultimately, I think there's a difference between a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset. See, Jesus is addressing people who have a scarcity mindset, right? That's why we store up. Because we feel like there is not enough money going around. Or more importantly, we feel like we don't worship a God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And so we tend to adopt a very scarce mindset. And so we store up. You see, you can either have a scarcity mindset, or you can have an abundance mindset. A mindset that says, my daddy, my God, my Father in heaven has more than enough to take care of me, so I'm not going to be so tight on money. But I'm actually going to intentionally start looking at how I can invest in things that last. Things that last forever. Scarcity mindset or abundance mindset? Which one are you? And so, I know I started off by comparing spenders and savers, but there's a third category, a third S that I wanted to mention today, and we're up on the screen here, is that it's sower. Right? And the modern terminology for sowers, I believe, is just an investor, but the Bible uses the language of sowing quite a bit in the New Testament. Yesterday I had time with the kids because we had the ladies' event here. So I had the whole morning with my beautiful kiddies, and so we were playing out in the backyard. And during the week, Mila got given a seed, and so her automatic response to that was, I need to sow this thing, right? And so without even anyone telling her, like, she digs up soil in the garden, she plants the seed in, she buries it, she waters it, and she comes and tells me, look, I've sown this seed. So I'm like, oh, that's so cool. But what's interesting is that 20 minutes later, both Mila and Mila, they go and check and see, has anything grown? Oh, no, and then half an hour later, they go back and check, has anything come out? No, see, a sower has to be patient, because you know that what you sow into, ultimately, it takes a while for it to germinate and start growing, right? In terms of that seed germinating and it becoming a plant or a flower or a tree, whatever the case is. And sowers are like that. Like when they invest in something, they're not expecting immediate results, but they know that slowly over time, as they're chipping away, ultimately they'll see fruit. I mean, that's how I view books in my life. You know, when I first heard about this concept that you should try and read about 40 or 50 books a year, so I thought, okay, I'm going to start doing that. Year one, I was like, what is this? Like, I read 50 books this year. Like, it's done nothing for me. Year two, it's like still nothing. Year three was when I thought, oh my goodness, I'm starting to see the fruit of this. You know, as the more I invest into this, I see the benefits of this. So now I'm like, I don't hesitate anymore. You know, and that's a sower's mentality. Like when you start shifting your mindset from just spending and saving to actually, I'm sowing into something eternal. You have a long-term mindset. Like you play the long game because ultimately you know that it's going to bear fruit. So the question is, what do you want to sow into today? What do you want to invest into today in your life? I want to read to you a passage from Luke 12, 16 to 21. And this is what is commonly known as the parable of the rich fool. But it says this, I'll read from verse 15. It's up from verse 16 on your slide, but I'll read from verse 15. Jesus says, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you earn. Can I say that again? Life is not measured by how much you earn. And he says, and he told them a story. A rich man had a fertile farm and produced fine crops. He said to himself, what should I do? I don't have room for all my crops. Then he said, I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns, right? Bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all of my wheat and my other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, you will die this very night. You will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. Let me read that last line again. A person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but does not have a rich relationship with God. You see, this guy was one of those people who was just storing up treasures on earth. And like the more he made, he was like, no, I need to build bigger barns so that I can store more and more and more, so that I can take it easy, so that I have enough for the rest of my life. I have enough for retirement and all of those things that we planned for. But we don't know how long we're going to live, right? This guy acted as if he was going to live for the next 30, 40 years. And God said to him, you fool, you do not know that you were going to die tonight. What's going to happen with all of those things that you want to store up? And Jesus is saying, like, man, this guy was just focused on earthly wealth. And he was not rich towards God. In other words, he was saying, this man was not rich towards the purposes of God in the world. This man was not rich towards God's plan of redemption and restoration and renewal of the world. He was not rich toward what God wants to do in this world. He was not rich towards what God values in this world. He's only thinking about himself. Unfortunately, he was only thinking about himself. And then we'll end today with the next verse in our text today, verse 21 of Matthew 6, that Jesus says, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. So where is your treasure this morning? Where is your treasure this morning? See, a couple of years ago, I felt like the Lord was calling me to write, because it's a gift that He's given me, and I was just kind of ignoring it and just putting it aside. And, I would write the odd blog on the odd occasion, but I wasn't really writing, and I felt that he was calling me to write. And so I started writing. I started writing a book on what God is doing in my heart. And but eventually that kind of, dissipated for a while, and I stopped writing. And I just felt like God was nudging me and kept on saying what he said to Timothy, fan to flame the gift that I've given you. Right. And so I started taking this seriously. And so I set aside 2 hours every week to write. Until eventually, in March of this year, I finished a book. It's like, lo and behold, just because I was writing repetitively, I finished a book. And so I haven't really spoken about it much. I've kept it on the down low, but I finished this book, and so started looking for a publisher. And what was crazy was that I drew a list of about 35 publishers that I could approach, right? And so I started looking at their websites and this and that, and the more I looked, the more disappointed I was, because man, it seemed like you needed to either be an established author, or you needed, contacts or whatever to actually get into this business. And so I was starting to consider self-publishing and all of that, and speaking to different people about it, and I didn't know how to go about this. And then randomly, out of the blue, one day, I got this email from these publishers who are part of major publishers in the world. They're a division of it, and the subject line of the email was, "Are you looking to publish a book?" I was like, what? Because I get emails from these people every week on all kinds of things. So when you get spammed like that, you don't really tend to pay attention much. But that week, I paid attention to this, But then, I was so naive about the publishing industry, and I realized that actually you need to invest some money into this, right? Like, no one does anything for free, right? No one is going to put things together for you. No one is going to publish a book for you for free. And so now I was left with this massive dilemma, right? I could either dig into my savings and spend some money in this to actually publish this book, or not have a book published. So I was left with this dilemma, and I just remember being angry with God. I'm like, you asked me to write, and now I have to spend money on this. Like, what is going on? And I'll never forget how the Holy Spirit just gently rebuked me, and he said, what are you investing into when you spend money on publishing this book? And I remember just like feeling so convicted that day, and God saying to me, you don't know the number of people who are going to read this stuff. And you don't know how I'm going to use this content to actually bless people. So you investing into this is actually not about you. It's not about you. It's about getting this book into the hands of people who need to read it. And so that just shifted my mind completely. Then I said, okay, actually, you know what, like, I own this, I actually need to invest some money into this. Here's where I want to land this morning. The greatest treasure that you can invest your money into is people. It's people made in the image of God. Because it's people who last forever. Right? It's people who do not get destroyed by moth and rust. It's people who last forever. Our greatest treasure should be people in various forms, in various ways. It's people, friends. It's people who are our greatest treasure. So you can't take things with you, right? I mean, I've never seen a Fanta trailer attached to a coffin before. Never, ever. Right? You can't take these things with you. You don't have control over the economy. You don't have control over how the market turns out. But what you have control over is what is your treasure. And Jesus is saying, store up treasure in heaven, because one day you will see those treasures. You will see the things that you invested into that lasted forever. And chances are, most of it has had to do with people in some way or the other. Yes, spend money on putting a roof over your head, spend money on putting food on the table, all those things. Yes, God provides for those things. But what are we willing to invest our money in and sow into? Because our mindset needs to shift from just spending and saving to actually sowing and watching over time the things that will start to grow and last forever. People is our greatest treasures, friends. And we need to change our mindset in terms of what we sow into. Because ultimately, man, there's ultimately no budget, no limit for sowing into people. And there's various ways you can use your money to sow into. You may not be someone who has a lot of money, but you know what, like, Jesus even speaks about getting someone a cold cup of water, right, in the scriptures. But how that blesses them, and as you do unto them, it's almost like you said, you've done unto me. Sometimes you can just buy a 10 rand liter of water and just give it to a person standing at the roadside who's begging for food, who's been beaten down by the hot summer's sun. You know, sometimes you can cook a meal for someone else in the church who's really struggling. Like, you may be investing maybe just 100 rand into that meal, but that meal has meant so much to them. You're investing into people more than anything else. This also includes giving, right? Because when you're giving to the church, you're not just giving to money that just disappears. You don't know what happens into it or with it. You're investing into people who are serving the local church. And so we've got to think about money that way. And what is our greatest treasure? And I think the scriptures are encouraged to say that our greatest treasure should be people. And we need to sow, keep sowing and investing into people, because that's what lasts forever. It's because people last forever. They are of infinite worth, infinite value, and therefore that's why they have to be our greatest treasure. So our treasures in heaven, friends, but moth and rust don't destroy. Because where your treasure is, that is where your heart's desire should be. And that's my prayer, is that our heart's desire will continuously be for people, for the growth of people, for the growth of who they are, their well-being, to see their humanity become more and more like Christ. Ultimately, that's what we're investing into. That's what we're sowing into. Let me pray for us.